Hello, I'm Dominic Pino, and this is a Capital Writing Author interview. Our guest today is Jennifer Burns. Dr. Burns is an associate professor of history at Stanford University. She's also a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. And previously, she's the author of the book Goddess of the Market, which is a biography of Ayn Rand. Now she is writing a book called The Last Conservative about Milton Friedman. It's the first archival scholarly biography of Milton Friedman. Clocks in at around 500 pages. It is comprehensive, that is for sure, but it is a gripping read to anybody who's interested in free markets, anybody who's interested in the history of the conservative movement in the United States, and of course, anyone who's interested in learning more about the life and thought of Milton Friedman. And so we're very grateful to have you with us today, Dr. Burns, and looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Nice to see you again.
All right. So, Milton Friedman, you call him the last conservative. This is kind of a funny title to give him. He's, of course, most well known in libertarian circles. He's very well known for certainly not being a partisan thinker. He's willing to sort of smash sacred cows on anybody's side as long as he thinks that it's the right thing to do from his philosophical perspective. Why do you call him a conservative as opposed to a libertarian or something else?
So there's kind of two ways in which I mean this title. One is that when I researched his economics, one thing I found was really distinctive about him is that he had a way of using economic approaches and methodologies and ideas that most of his contemporaries had decided were old-fashioned and no longer helpful or interesting. So one example of this would be the quantity theory of money, which was an older idea that he really rehabilitated and used as a foundation for monetarism. Another would be just simply the practice of going out and measuring what individual consumers were doing in the economy and trying to kind of add up all those figures as opposed to making a more abstract model that looks from the top down. So in that way, I think of him as an economist who tried to conserve what was best about economic thought in the past. And in some ways, he's really a political economist because he tied these ideas to a larger vision of state and society and markets and individual freedom. And so the second dimension of him being a conservative is that he worked most closely with political leaders and intellectuals and organizations that consider themselves part of the American conservative movement. And, you know, it's conservatism in America is distinctive in that it does incorporate, or it did in the 20th century, incorporate these ideas similar to those Friedman espoused on individual freedom, capitalism, markets, and those ideas were sometimes in tension with other aspects of the coalition. But I try to show in my work really how fundamental Friedman was to that style of conservatism, which really emerged after the post-war era and became very dominant for the next 50 or 60 years.
Yeah, you mentioned the quantity theory of money as one of the things that Friedman kind of brought back to the forefront of economists' attention. There's, of course, the famous sort of put down from another economist that said, you know, Friedman, he always is thinking about money, he puts it in every paper. I think about sex all the time, but I don't put it in every paper. This was a famous put down is it Robert Solow or Robert Barrow?
I think it was Solow. Yeah.
Solo, yeah. So this idea was, as you said, it was seen as outdated. It was seen as silly as well. But Friedman got a lot of mileage out of it by putting together the monetary history of the United States with Anna Schwartz. So can you talk a little bit about that book and how bringing that idea back led to that monumental work of scholarship?
Yeah, so I think that quip you mentioned by Robert Solow really does sum up where Friedman was for many years, how he was considered by fellow economists, that he was kind of obsessed with this thing that really didn't matter, or he was driven by his ideology to focus on something that was really peripheral. And when Friedman began his research with Anna Schwartz, the two of them joined on a project at the National Bureau of Economic Research starting in 1948. And at that point, most economists thought of money in the modern economy as a veil. It sort of lay over economic activity, but it didn't drive economic activity more fundamentally. And a lot of that conclusion came from the experience of the Great Depression, where it seemed like there wasn't any possibility for the monetary authorities to kind of stimulate the economy and to fix the problem. So that gave rise to the idea of Keynesian economics, and that the federal budget and the federal government was really where the action was. So Friedman, because of his education at the University of Chicago, was suspicious of this idea, but he didn't really have any way to convincingly argue against it. And so he and Schwartz basically decided to construct a history of money in the United States. And I say construct like they literally found the quantities and they added up in these charts. I reproduced some of them in the book, of how much money was in the banking sector at different periods in history, starting with basically the aftermath of the Civil War. And so they were able to have what was called a time series, a series of data that went over 150 years, something like that. And that really showed the relationship between changes in the amount of money and changes in economic activity. And that became the way Friedman was able to argue money matters, which is really the best succinct summary of his monetarism.
And you mentioned consumption economics as well as this idea of something that was seen as not important by other economists, but it was for slightly different reason. As you say in the book, the reason that consumption economics was frowned upon from other economists is that it was seen as being for women, and that it was seen as no true male economist would concern himself with this. This is kind of a subfield of the discipline that we have for women, and that we shouldn't. And that men doing the serious work or whatever shouldn't be taking this, shouldn't be spending too much time on this. And Friedman comes in and says, no, actually, I think this is important. And he actually worked with a lot of the women economists who were prominent in that field at the time. And you talk about that in the book. Can you sort of go into how Friedman came to that realization and why he chose to do that against the advice of a lot of his other male colleagues?
So yeah, consumption was important, especially in terms of the Keynesian synthesis, but most economists were thinking of kind of top down, looking at it sort of top down. And Friedman had, because of his wife Rose and her close relationships, experience with this older tradition of, again, going out into the field with surveys and interviewing people and figuring out how they made their consumption decisions. And pretty soon they discovered this idea that, so underlying Keynesianism was this idea that there was a ratio of how much money people made to how much money people would spend, and that it was fairly straightforward. So if it's fairly straightforward, that means you can design a policy around it. You can design stimulus spending or money that goes out to Americans and kind of estimate how much of it they will spend and how much of it will influence the economy. And what Friedman discovered as he was in conversation with these women is, when you looked at the actual data about what people did with the money they had, the story was very complicated. And it wasn't sort of obvious if you gave a person $10 or a person received $10 in income, they would spend 8 of it. In some cases, they might spend 6 or they might spend 12. And so they were able to develop a new theory, the theory of the consumption function, about how people made these decisions. And so that was really the first piece of research that Friedman did, along with his wife and her best friend, Dorothy Brady, and a colleague of his, Margaret Reed. The 4 of them all really worked this idea out, and then Friedman wrote it up and published it. That was the first moment where economists like Solow were like, okay, this is important. We need to kind of start paying attention to Friedman. And then it was another, 5 years after that he came out with a monetary history. And that was really like, okay, we definitely need to stop what we're doing and figure out, is Friedman right? Or how do we argue with him or engage with it in some way?
Yeah, and eventually, famously, Ben Bernanke would admit that Friedman and Schwartz were right about the Federal Reserve's role in prolonging the Great Depression. One of the things about Schwartz as well that you kind of work into as a subplot of the book is the difficulties that she faced with getting her PhD. And it sounds like a completely crazy thing to us nowadays because now it's completely normal for women to get PhDs. It happens all the time, but also because Schwartz was a huge contributor to this work that for Friedman would be part of the reason he would win the Nobel Prize. He would win the Nobel Prize for other things he did as well that did not involve Schwartz, but his monetary history was a big part of the reason that the Nobel Committee awarded him that prize. And so clearly the research was fantastic. Clearly this is a person who should have the credential to match it. But for the longest time, Anna Schwartz could not get her PhD.
Yeah, and that was really fascinating and somewhat sad story to see through the archive. And even when Friedman started pushing for it, she had started a PhD at Columbia in the 30s, and by the 60s, she still had not gotten the PhD because they kept saying, well, you didn't really do that work. You did it with someone else. But interestingly, Friedman also did a co-authored dissertation and didn't face the same pushback. So I think it just goes to show how powerful, once you adhere to a set of ideas, which in this case was women aren't independent economic thinkers. They are technicians who can help the men who have the ideas, but they don't have their own ideas and they don't really make important contributions. Once that idea is afoot and people buy into it, they ignore the evidence in front of them. So what was interesting for me was both that, what she faced, and then why Friedman was able to see what was in front of his eyes and his colleagues weren't. And, I don't know that there's one particular answer. I think part of it is he just took people on the merits a little more, came more easily to him to think, who is this economist in front of me, as opposed to thinking, oh, this is a woman, therefore a lesser economist. And then he also, was in an economics department that had a tradition of having at least one female faculty member. So in Chicago, that was unusual. So he had studied under and seen women in positions of, somewhat authority and somewhat respect as economists. So I think that actually served him very well. And as I talk about in the book, you add all the women up who contributed to his work, it's really quite substantial. And if you took them away, he would have a very different profile.
Yeah, and one of those people, of course, is his wife, Rose, who was a very able economist herself. They met at Chicago, and then would get married, and of course, they co-authored one book, later in life. But she was there a lot of the time as well, and helping him to sharpen his ideas. You talk in the book about their household must have just been so argumentative, not necessarily in a bad or nasty way, but just in a sort of constantly sharpening arguments intellectually, and
Yeah.
doing that, at the dinner table, and just in the sort of other situations where people would just be making small talk. They were arguing about these big ideas. And
Yeah, they had a dinner table code, which was something, they had a series of numbers, and number one was I was wrong and you were right, to kind of ease things along, or I guess keep the argument moving. Yeah, Rose was a fascinating figure. One thing that was tricky about trying to understand the work that she did is she helped put together the archive. So Friedman's papers are held here at the Hoover Institution, and where Friedman was a fellow in the last years of his life. So Rose helped organize the papers and put them, in boxes and things. And she took out anything about herself.
mm,
And so she was a very private person. She didn't want someone like me coming along and snooping in her business. So I've had to reconstruct somewhat indirectly the role she played, but we know from their own testimony that she was really the driving force behind getting Capitalism and Freedom published, and then also essential to the Free to Choose series and the book that came out of it.
Yeah, Free to Choose is something that sort of brought Friedman into a more popular audience. He was, of course, already a major player on the political scene. He was an advisor to presidents. He was seen as a very prominent economist. He had already done basically all of his original research and theorizing and all of his academic papers by that point. But then in 1980, with Free to Choose, it tries to make a television series that anybody could watch about his political philosophy. And one of the things that blew me away in your book is you reported that they had viewership of 3 million people for this. And this was in a country with about 100 million fewer people than today. And so I just can't imagine having 3 million people sitting down on their couch watching Milton Friedman talk about the Great Depression in like excruciating detail. Because if you watch Free to Choose, you can watch it on YouTube. It's
Yeah.
free. You could watch the entire series. It's he really he doesn't dumb it down, right? Like he's actually going through a lot of his scholarship at a very high level, and like 3 million people, 3 million Americans are watching this. What was that like in that time, and why is it? Part of me just wonders why it's so different now.
Yeah, I know. Well, was a very consolidated media landscape. So there were a couple of major magazines, a couple of major television networks, and Friedman had this public profile first through his association with Barry Goldwater, and then he was on the cover of Time magazine in the early 70s. He was on the cover of the New York Times magazine, and then he had a column in Newsweek that had run for, it ended up running for almost 20 years. So people knew who Milton Friedman was. And it wasn't like this was a completely unknown economist turning up. So they had some knowledge of him, some curiosity. But it wouldn't happen today because that those 3 million viewers are spread out over so much more. Free to Choose is definitely worth a look. It's kind of kitschy to our modern sensibility, but Friedman really did the first half of the series is him explaining different economic concepts, often in a different locale. And the second half is a debate. And it's a real debate. He brings in people who really disagree with him and even seem to dislike him, and people then who agree with him. And he doesn't always win the debate. So, yeah, I think people knew who Friedman was. I think also they understood Friedman was part of not officially part of the Reagan campaign, but he was part of a shift afoot in the country, a sense that with the stagflation of the 1970s, the Carter presidency kind of winding to an end, Reagan looking like a contender, it was understood that Friedman was kind of embodying a new shift in ideas and politics that would be trying to limit government, trying to roll back regulations, trying to reduce taxes. And so, in some ways, this TV series was a preview of things to come. So I think people were drawn to it both because of Friedman's reputation and his charisma and their sense that this could be our political future, or do we want it to be our political future? So they're learning something about that as well, because this was, I think it was a best-selling book in 1980, which is also the year of Reagan's presidential campaign. So it was part of something larger. It was part of a larger political and even social shift.
Yeah, it's crazy to think now though that Friedman's sort of peak political influence directly in the political process in terms of being advisor to politicians and being close with people who are advising politicians and that sort of thing was really during the Nixon administration. He was very close with George Shultz, for example, who was very close with Nixon at that point. And he got a couple things out of that. He's a big part of the reason why the draft was ended. He was a big part of
Mm-hmm.
arguing for that. But of course, Nixon was not a small government guy. I mean, this is a guy who started the EPA, did price and wage controls, was by no means a deregulator. This was not a person
Yeah.
who, if you looked at his record, you would not have guessed that Milton Friedman was close with his administration. Do you think that was something that Friedman kind of learned a lesson there of the problems with politics? Did you think that did he get a little bit too excited about the possibilities there, and then was sort of hit by the reality, which he probably should have expected all along, given his political philosophy?
So I would say he's always at arm's length with Nixon, but Nixon is a big shift in his thinking. And before I get to that, let me just say in domestic policy, he had just strikeout after strikeout. The wage and price controls, there was an effort to institute a policy based on his negative income tax, the family assistance plan, but it had changed quite a bit by the time it came out into the Congress. So Friedman ended up not supporting it the monetary policy of Arthur Burns was, everything Friedman disliked. I'm sure we'll cover that. Nixon himself pressured the Federal Reserve, did not respect its independence. But on international affairs, Friedman had a real effect. And this was because Nixon's presidency spanned the ending of Bretton Woods, which was the currency system set up after World War II. And this set up ratios for international currencies to be traded. And Friedman was one of the first to say, this is not going to work long term. In the 1950s, he was saying this is not going to last. It's going to become unbalanced. And actually, that's good. We should have free exchange rates. International currencies should be like any other good in the market, that if people really want them, their price goes up. If people don't want them, their price goes down. And so he theorized this idea in the 1956, I believe it was. And then through his friendship with George Shultz, who rose to be Secretary of Treasury, he was able to push this idea forward and really be a voice in Shultz's ear as they considered, should we try to save Bretton Woods or should we kind of let it go? And so Friedman really helped convince Shultz to let it go. And it did start to decompose, and a new international order based on mostly on floating exchange rates came to pass. So for Nixon, you have to separate the foreign and the domestic to kind of understand Friedman's influence. The other thing I will say, though, is, as you pointed out, because Nixon was not conservative and because the government grew so much in his time, Friedman became more cynical about politics. And he came to believe that government grows. That's like its fundamental dynamic. And even when there's a Republican in power, it's going to grow. And that Republican may become convinced that's a good thing. And so you see after the Nixon administration, he becomes much more interested in things like tax limitation. He becomes more comfortable with budget deficits. And he just becomes more likely to emphasize even more the negatives of government. Friedman is never an anarchist. He's never full laissez-faire. But he becomes more anti-government in the wake of Nixon.
You mentioned Arthur Burns. Arthur Burns, famous for being the Federal Reserve chairman in the late 60s and into the 70s, and he was sort of seen as the guy who completely lost control of inflation. Inflation had been a problem before Burns came in, but he sort of was seen as the one that it really became a disaster under in the 70s, and then then Paul Volcker in the late 70s and early 80s sort of cleaned up his mess. That's kind of the conventional wisdom of how the Federal Reserve history is seen. And one of the things I didn't fully appreciate until reading your book is how close Burns and Friedman were personally. They, as you said, they completely disagreed, and I'm sure you'll talk about the evidence you found for this, but they completely disagreed about monetary policy in the 70s when Burns was chairman of the Fed. But they personally, they had known each other for a very long time, and Friedman, you say in the book, Friedman sort of saw Burns as kind of a father figure to him. So can you go into their relationship a little bit more?
Sure. And those are actually Friedman's words to describe Arthur Burns as a surrogate father. And they met when Friedman was a young man who had lost his own father in high school, and then met Burns when he started college at Rutgers. And although Burns was not that much older than Friedman, by virtue of being his teacher, he sort of became the wise man in Friedman's life. And one of the great sources of my research was these letters that Milton Friedman would send to Arthur Burns throughout his life. Very long and detailed personal letters about every aspect of what he was experiencing, not just economics letters. So I was able to use these letters to kind of reconstruct Friedman's life. And then, everybody knew they were close. And when Burns was appointed to the Fed, there was a lot of kind of articles in the media saying, oh, this is a victory for Milton Friedman. This will be a monetarist Fed. The Fed will never doubt that money matters. That's not what happened, because it turned out Arthur Burns did not really accept Friedman's ideas about inflation. He had other explanations for inflation that were common at the time, being a wage price spiral, or other things like that. And he thought the Fed couldn't do anything about it. And so he came out in support of first wage and price guidelines and then eventually wage and price controls. And this was a crisis for Milton Friedman. And I talk about it. I found some letters in the archive that are they just ring with emotion, because Friedman felt, as he said, betrayed. And he also realized, because of his long history of criticizing the Federal Reserve, that he was now going to have to publicly criticize his oldest and dearest friend. And he didn't for a minute think he had any other option. He knew intellectual honesty was such a value for him. He knew that the media was going to come to him. They love a good story, right? Oh, Mr. Friedman, what do you think of Mr. Burns's monetary policy? And he knew he was going to have to say, I don't agree. And so he was tortured. And Burns was really upset with him, and they had some frosty letters back and forth. And then, Burns kept on doing what he was going to do. And as Friedman had predicted, and as Friedman was telling him in these letters, you're going to have more inflation. You're heading towards more inflation. And Burns would just say, I don't agree. You're wrong. This is a short-term problem. And what is doubly ironic is this is the moment when the economics profession is starting to realize Friedman is right about a lot of these things about inflation. And so just as everyone is kind of moving more towards Friedman, Arthur Burns is very stubbornly forging his own path. And he had like an insider's view. He had all the information he needed to course correct, and he simply would not. And so that was really a personal crisis for Friedman, even as it vindicated many of his ideas.
And sort of the flip side of that is in the 80s with Paul Volcker as Fed chairman, and he's seen as the guy who got inflation back under control. And of course, inflation did get back under control and stayed under control really until COVID. And so, he did this by raising interest rates to as high as 20%. This was just a massive change in monetary policy. And if the 70s was a problem because people weren't listening to Friedman, it might be tempting to think that the 80s was the solution because they were listening to Friedman. But you point out in the book that Volcker and Friedman actually didn't get along and really weren't very close at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because the man who followed his policy was the one he disliked personally, and the one he liked personally didn't follow his policy. So you kind of can't win. Yes, Volcker was influenced by Friedman, but he was also an experimentalist. So he was trying a bunch of different approaches, but he absolutely had absorbed Friedman's fundamental idea that you can't trade inflation off against unemployment over the long term. And then therefore, really what the Federal Reserve should do is focus on lowering inflation, because if you lower inflation, you will have lower unemployment. Whereas if you try to lower unemployment, you'll end up with high inflation and high unemployment. So the overall picture and the overall sense of priorities, he very much shared with Friedman, although the two of them did not like each other. Now, where Friedman played this really important role, the way he did not in the Nixon administration, was in really keeping Ronald Reagan steadfast in the idea of an independent Federal Reserve and supporting Volcker's policy, which, because inflation had been so ingrained, was very painful. It caused very high unemployment. Interest rates were devastating for so many Americans to be that high. And Friedman would just say, as he met with Reagan, stay the course. This is going to work. Don't backtrack. And, probably Reagan would have stayed the course anyhow, but it really meant a lot to him to have this economist who he so liked and respected just saying, you're doing the right thing. You're doing the right thing. So that's a real place where he was influential. Even though Friedman was retired, he was on an informal advising board, but he didn't have any position within the administration, nor did he in really any presidential administration.
I would be remiss now, you mentioned Reagan, his influence on Reagan, of course, a very prominent figure in the American conservative movement. Another one is Bill Buckley. Buckley and Friedman were friends as well. Buckley had Friedman on firing line, one of the earlier episodes of firing line in the late '60s. So this was before Free to Choose, before all of that stuff. He was on firing line at that point. But Friedman and Buckley were close. Can you talk a little bit more about their friendship?
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, in the beginning, Friedman was a little bit unsure about Buckley because Buckley was critical or ran a critical article about the Mont Pelerin Society in National Review. And so Friedman sort of chastised him for that, saying, young man, you don't know what you're talking about. But then when Buckley tried to push the John Birch Society out of the organized conservative movement, Friedman was very supportive of that. And there were kind of warm letters back and forth. And then in the mid 1960s, Friedman spent a year in New York City as a visiting professor at Columbia. And that's when they really connected. And, I think Friedman represented for Buckley kind of where he was trying to take the conservative movement. Friedman was educated. He was extremely articulate. He was a Jewish man, which helped separate Buckley style conservatism from an older, more isolationist, anti Semitic conservatism. So it really was a relationship of mutual advantage. And then, they were both very witty and quick and smart and loved to talk. And so they got along really well. By the 1980s, they were taking a ski trip together every year to Utah. And Buckley writes about that quite fondly in one of his memoirs. So I think eventually it was a real meeting of the minds and of the personalities because, the two of them could talk like no one else and really
Yeah,
connect.
it's crazy to think that they had that connection given the huge differences in their backgrounds. I mean, like you said, Friedman was Jewish, of course. Buckley was Catholic. Buckley grew up in a very wealthy family. Friedman not so much, and but it was sort of the union of their ideas here that brought them together.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to kind of some of the opening discussion of the synthetic nature of 20th century conservatism, that Buckley was very traditional in his religious beliefs, in his social approach, yet he also really appreciated a figure like Friedman, who was more libertarian, more focused on individual freedom, more focused on capitalism. And the two of them could just work together really well and didn't perceive that they had to fight and argue, and perceive that they wanted much of the same things on the global scale and on the domestic scale, and they would work together in partnership. And I think that was really a strength that, either one of these men could have been a purist and could have said, I don't agree with you in these four ways and we can't work together. But they looked for what they had in common, not what was different.
And that approach would not work so well with Ayn Rand, the other person you've written a book about. Buckley and Ayn Rand did not get along at all. Ayn Rand, of course, was a big fan of capitalism, probably a little bit too big a fan of capitalism. They were not able to do that. They were not able to have that kind of intellectual synthesis because of Rand would say it was because of Buckley's religion. Buckley would say because of Rand's sort of monomaniacal focus on certain things and the inability to kind of deviate in any way. Whereas Friedman was much more pragmatic's not the right word, but he was much more able to, I guess, adjust to circumstances and be able to be in multiple places at once on things. What do you think it is about sort of Rand's version of of capitalism and freedom that is so different from Friedman's version of capitalism and freedom?
Yeah, it's a good question. And Friedman incidentally called Rand something like a deeply unpleasant woman who did a great deal of good, because I think he recognized how many people came to his ideas or to Buckley's conservatism like via Ayn Rand as the kind of first person they encountered, offering a different set of ideas. So I think a lot of it has to do with tone. Friedman was a happy warrior and Rand was kind of an angry warrior. I also think it has to do with, from the beginning, Friedman was concerned, he was very pro-capitalist, but he was also concerned that in any society, there are some people who can't make a living in capitalist markets for whatever reason it may be. And this is not just something for private charity. This is something that government has to think about and society as a whole has to think about. And his first solution to this was something akin to a universal basic income, which he later refined to a negative income tax. And his thinking was this would prevent anyone from falling into dire poverty in, an advanced capitalist society. This would support them without encumbering the general price system or the general economic approach. In later years, this became a real emphasis on education and his belief that you needed to get education, competition into public education in order to prepare Americans for this newly globalized competitive world. And you don't see any elements like that in Ayn Rand. She's not thinking about what do I do about the people who are left out? She's thinking what's more important is to make that case for capitalism as strong as possible. And I'm not going to dilute the case by thinking about any negative externalities or market failures or anything like that, where Friedman has an ability to think about that. So I think that kind of softens his approach. And then he's an extrovert who genuinely enjoys other people and interacting with them. And I think that's not true of Rand. And I think people see that in the public figure.
One of the interesting distinctions that you draw in the book that I had never thought about in quite the way you express it is the distinction between being concerned about inequality and being an egalitarian. Now, there's you say Friedman was not an egalitarian. He was not someone that believed that everyone would be better off if we made everyone equal. That's not what he thought. He understood that certain amounts of everyone does not have the same means to do things. Like you said, some people, just for various different reasons, do not have an ability to make a living the same way that other people do. And so we all have different skills, different talents, and that's part of life. And it's actually a good thing, right? We wouldn't want to force everyone to be equal. That would be bad. So he was certainly not an egalitarian, but he was nonetheless concerned about inequality. And you mentioned the negative income tax as one of his solutions for that. Also, school choice, making sure that people would get a good education. What do you think it was about sort of his background or his either personally or intellectually that led him to that sort of position? And do you think that way of thinking is still widespread today?
So, yeah, I think part of his emphasis, part of his understanding that egalitarianism wasn't like a viable social philosophy is that if you had choice, which was really important to him, if you had individual choice, people were going to choose different things. And some people were going to choose activities that are more highly compensated in the market and some are not. And so by definition, if you have freedom, you have inequality. It's going to follow from that. And then, of course, he does admit in a way that Ayn Rand wouldn't that some people are, they're handicapped, or he talks about the madman or children in capitalism and freedom. So I think a lot of, the concern about inequality in general comes from his lived experience. He lived through the Great Depression, and he arrived at the University of Chicago in 1932 when people were walking the streets begging, and people who had been prosperous and stable a few years ago were living on the streets or taking, their meals at soup kitchens. And so he understood this was a terrible thing. There was a systemic crisis. People had really gotten in trouble for it. He understood that business cycles exist and that also financial bubbles and financial crises exist. And you couldn't just turn a blind eye to that. You had to focus on that. So, it was a combination of wanting to create a more free society, which would mean that not everyone, might end up getting what they needed, and also just a recognition that life is complicated, emergencies and crises happen, and that the government has to respond both sort of ethically and in terms of its own legitimacy. And this was really hammered into him by two of his teachers. One was Frank Knight at the University of Chicago, And Knight had a bit of a darker view on it, in which he felt that classical liberalism, or liberalism as he called it at the time, was really being challenged by socialism, social democracy, fascism, communism, and all these creeds were offering more to their followers and were offering them more on the material side of things. And that if liberalism couldn't make a similar offer, it was not going to be able to compete in sort of a democratic world. And so he really felt like the survival of freedom requires compromising and changing our economic ideas. Another one of Friedman's teachers was Henry Simons. And Simons, while I wouldn't say he was an egalitarian, he comes a bit closer to Friedman, and he comes out of more the American kind of prairie populist tradition a bit, where what he really focuses on is the individual producer and the kind of small business owner or the small farmer, the producer. It's a form of American producerism, and that person is threatened by big conglomerations of power, be they in the state or be they in the market. So it's threatened by monopolies, it's threatened by government regulation, and he really wanted to kind of create a place where that individual entrepreneur could thrive. And so for him, inequality is something he objects to morally and aesthetically, because it threatens the person or the ideal that was kind of at the center of his vision. So Friedman is going to be just steeped in the thought of Knight and of Simons. That's like the foundation of his ideas. And they'll stay with him really until the end of his life. Although, as I said, they kind of wax and wane. And as the United States becomes more prosperous in the 1950s, he becomes less concerned about inequality. And I see that concern coming back a bit in the end of his life, the early aughts, or the early 2000s, when he's seeing, he's looking at globalization and wondering how that's going to play out.
You talked about Simons, you talked about Knight as these foundational people in his University of Chicago education. You just go in a little bit more about the intellectual community that Chicago had at that time, and it was probably a little bit cultish in some aspects, right? This was, a lot of, it seemed very insular. You kind of had an inner circle of people that spent a lot of time together. A lot of people, constantly arguing with each other about all these different things. They would put out, you talk about University of Chicago put out a plan to help the Great Depression, or to help end the Great Depression, I should say, that to modernize actually looks a little bit left wing compared to what we might expect from the University of Chicago. What was it about that particular environment that Friedman came out of that was he ever able to fully separate himself from that, or was this always sort of, is it helpful to think of that always being in the background of his mind, his University of Chicago price theory solves everything kind of training?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very powerful. And Chicago, I talk about in some detail, had a lot of really radical reforms to meet the crisis of the Great Depression, mostly focused on the banking system, and many of which were actually implemented in the early New Deal. And Chicago was focused on ideas and argument, and it also held itself apart methodologically from other departments. So in the beginning, it was very much opposed to institutional economics. And then it also had this alternate explanation for the Great Depression, the focus on monetary economics. So I think Friedman became comfortable there with being out of step with a broader profession, given once he had kind of a core of like-minded people to have his conversations with. It is important to note, though, he actually got his doctorate from Columbia. And so when he went to Columbia, he learned both mathematical economics, which he would turn his back on, and he actually learned the techniques of institutional economics. So a lot of what he and Schwartz did was, as we've talked about, related to women's consumption economics. It was also the methodology of institutional economics. But Friedman combined that with Chicago price theory, or kind of a neoclassical theoretical frame, which the institutional economists did not. So he borrowed from these two different schools and kind of created something new. And I do think over time, Chicago was like a really important home base for him, and it enabled him to really create an alternative within the field of economics. It's really remarkable how there was kind of this axis of like Harvard, MIT, and then there was Chicago as the outlier. And they really had a lot of conflict and disagreement, and that became what really drove the discipline forward. So that diversity of ideas was really important. And, eventually there was kind of a new Keynesian synthesis that incorporated a lot of Friedman's ideas, and kind of modified Keynesian ideas. And so this is ultimately very productive. But Friedman needed both a kind of like-minded base of supporters and cheerleaders and students that were focusing on the same questions. And then he loved having opposition. Like he loved getting out there and like doing a seminar at MIT and just like making them all so angry. Like, he really thrived on that kind of debate and
So
dialogue
I
in the
think
same way.
today in politics, there's kind of two stories about Milton Friedman. One story is that Milton Friedman runs everything. That the entire United States was taken over by Milton Friedman's ideas. This is, sometimes called neoliberalism, sometimes called market fundamentalism. They'll invent various different names for it, but they look at things like deregulation, low taxes, and various other things. And they say, look, Friedman runs everything. He's in control. We're still being ruled by the ghost of Milton Friedman today. Then there's the other side, which says basically, look, Milton Friedman, he wrote Capitalism and Freedom. That is a perfect kind of small government distillation of small government thinking. We live in a country today with a $2 trillion budget deficit. We have an enormous military. We have an administrative state that can basically do whatever it wants. Everyone ignored Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman hasn't gotten anything. Which one of those stories is right, or is the actual truth probably somewhere in between there?
Well, Friedman would agree with the last story because he was, towards the end of his life, he felt like, wait a second, we won the battle of ideas. Yet the thing I really care about is the size of government, and it has just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. So that may point us to the limitation of ideas versus ingrown pre-existing institutions and bureaucratic structures, which maybe are impervious or have their own kind of inner logic. The other thing about that other story, though, what that is reflecting is the way that his ideas became important, not just to conservatives or libertarians, but really broke out of partisanship and became important to Democrats, to liberals, and I would say really define the political center. And in part, that is because they talked about capitalism, and this has been a market oriented country. And with the demise of socialism and communism, there wasn't a sort of viable alternative to that. It's also because he proposed with things like the negative income tax or floating exchange rates or the volunteer army that we use prices and incentives instead of regulation to accomplish what we wanted to accomplish. So instead of telling everyone you have to serve in the army, we're going to incentivize them to serve in the army by offering them a package of benefits they can't get anywhere else. And so that has become a very common way to think about policy or social programs. It's not the only way, but it is a new approach, or was new when Friedman came along, and it's now a central basic approach. And so for people who don't want that approach ever, it feels like it's an imposition that Friedman kind of put on top of us. So I think part of it has to do with the way ideas get diluted. And so, like, the Federal Reserve isn't monetarist, but the Federal Reserve and international, central banks in general have absorbed a lot of the teachings of Friedman about their importance and about how they should approach inflation. So in that way, his imprint is so powerful. And in the way we think, for coronavirus relief, it was like, let's just push that cash out. That's a shadow of the negative income tax idea. On the other hand, the ever-growing state is exactly what Friedman didn't want. He wanted something like a federal government sized at 10% of GDP, which is pre-Depression era size. And that We don't really see states of that size in developed economies right now. So that may have been an unrealistic hope. But yeah, it's a little bit of both. And just because no thinker ever comes out with their list of things and like voila, it all happens. That's not how ideas move through societies or move through politics. And so to understand their impact, you have to look not just at the pure idea, but at the kind of shadows of it and the distillations of it that get taken up. That's
All
where
right, thank you
influence
so much.
lies.
The book is called Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. It's by Jennifer Burns. Like I said at the start, you could hardly find a better book to go through Friedman's life because it goes through in very close detail. It's a page turner if you're interested in this sort of thing. If you really like conservative history, if you really like the history of economics in the 20th century, I mean, Friedman's life spanned most of that time. And so just going through his life sort of takes you through the major events there. And so the book's really useful for that as well. And I would highly recommend it to anyone. It's available out. It's available in any bookstore right now. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for being with us.